We're down a couple of speakers, but we'll do our best. You guys hear me all right? Here it is. So figure if you guys are here at 9 and change in the morning, you really are interested in regulatory matters surrounding crypto and ICOs. I'm seeing some heads nod. Okay, so it's a small enough group, and there's a microphone right there that I'm told works. So we're gonna maybe tee things off and talk about some topics, but feel free to interact, and we'll make sure we're covering stuff up. So my name is Rob Massey. I'm a tax partner at Deloitte, and so tax a big part of the regulatory considerations for ICOs. We've been doing crypto for a long time, just over 5 years. We've been advising people throughout the crypto ecosystem. So we've got a nice base of background. We deal primarily with US Treasury, but also tax regulators around the world. So pretty interesting when you actually face off against these guys and test the theories with the regulators. So we can talk a little bit about that. Neil?
I'm Neil Thakur with Technos Associates. We're a valuation and advisory services firm. We focus on all sorts of emerging growth technology companies, and obviously I lead the crypto and token practice for us. We've been involved for a few years ourselves and worked with Rob on many occasions on various valuation-related issues, and we'll explore some of that today as well.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Miroshnik. I run a digital asset-focused investment bank called the Element Group, based in Los Angeles and New York. We do token advisory and corporate finance, work closely with a broker-dealer on the emerging field of security tokens. We have an asset manager, an OTC business, and a technology business focused on building tools for the tokenization and token sale processes. Have had the pleasure of working with Rob many times, and I've always enjoyed the experience and the expertise, and here to hopefully add some value to this discussion in some way.
Absolutely, and we're going to talk about collaboration among advisors as well as the regulatory piece. And the reason for that is there's all these codependencies. You're going to think about securities laws, you're going to think about tax, right? You're going to think about, you know, when somebody beats you up from a valuation perspective, you're going to think about, you know, broker-dealer transactions. We're sort of dancing around all this stuff, and so us working together collaboratively, understanding how this fits together, it's a pretty big deal, right? You can't just go, I don't think it's healthy to be caught in the middle of your advisors. You want to bring everybody together and collaborate, and we've worked together before, and that's worked really well. So to set the table, what are we talking about with the regulatory sense? So we think a lot about tax from an income tax perspective, indirect taxes, sales tax here, VAT abroad, payroll tax is a big deal. One key person who is not here due to some weather constraints, so Lowell Ness is an attorney with Perkins Coie. We might refer to him as sitting in that chair just because he tends to drive a bit of this. Unfortunate that he's not here, and so we can't speak to securities laws, but we might reference it a little bit because it's probably the biggest regulatory piece that we think about, so we are cognizant, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think making sure that we're all kind of on point and collaborating and making sure that we're all brought in at various times, but earlier better than later, and making sure that we're all kind of communicating. It's probably the most important thing, and certainly advice from counsel and guys like Lowell is certainly very important.
So if we were to build a list of all the regulatory sensitivities, right? There's a lot on tax, okay? We touched on securities law a little bit, but let's maybe fill that list a little bit more. So what are the key dependencies that you think about when you're advising people from a valuation perspective?
Well, I think from our perspective, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about, you know, what a token is and how it's perceived. Is it a security token? Is a utility token? Obviously, there's a lot of discussion about that. Those are things that you want to think about, at least from our perspective, and those are things that we touch on. Let's see, there's a ton of other things. I mean, do you have some thoughts on it?
Let's make this real, though. So from your perspective, you get brought in when people are valuing tokens in what people call token allocations. Are we still calling them that? That's okay. That's a popular phrase. So I think most of us know what that is. But why is that relevant to you from a regulatory perspective?
Sure. And so from a from a token allocation, like a regulatory perspective, it's what is going to individuals within a company or so forth. It could be to advisors, it could be how much is going to founders, and we care about how that's allocated, because that will depend specifically in terms of how we look at it from a valuation perspective. So there are perspectives we take that if there are certain amounts of tokens being given to founders, they fall under certain tax guidelines. And when those tax guidelines are, let's say, for example, compensation, that's when we get brought in, and that's why we care about that. And there are certain specific types of valuation methodologies that we will apply in that analysis. And so we care about how much is going to founders, and then let's say it's some that are going to investors in some perspective, and and then those could be looked at in a different valuation context. So those are things you really want to be concerned about when, or thinking about at least at the very early stages.
So token allocation is very popular, and as Neil said, when you allocate tokens to a human, generally this is a taxable transaction, right? To at least the recipient and sometimes the company as well. And there's other regulatory sensitivities around that, people who fall into, I think, quote unquote, an accredited investor bucket. And Stan, I know you spend a lot of time talking about token allocations on the front end, helping people design. Can you put a little more meat on that one?
Yeah, I think as someone who kind of quarterbacks the whole transaction, we're really focused on the entirety of the package staying compliant and being within the fairway of kind of the latest thinking and signaling that's coming from the regulators. And so we look at it not only from the tax perspective, but also the kind of the evolving legal frameworks that are being put forth both in the U.S. and internationally. We care about sources of funds, AML, KYC, and how that's executed in the transaction. We care, and all of that has knock-on effects onto how you market the transaction, or whether you market it at all, how you communicate about it, what the form of the disclosure is, how investors interact with your team at conferences like this, how investors interact with your website, and kind of making sure that the entire package is compliant. And so, it's been a dynamic space, and maybe Lowell's not here for that exact reason. is there fewer clear answers and fewer sources of kind of truth and how exactly things should be done? People are kind of reading the tea leaves of what's coming out from various regulators, from CFTC, the OCC, the SEC, the DOJ, and trying to kind of synthesize that into a cohesive view. Understanding that the existing securities laws in many ways still apply, that regulated activity is still regulated activity, and then you have to be keenly aware of how it should be performed, who is licensed and is allowed to perform it. And so all of those considerations go into the first few kind of kickoff type discussions as you start the project that kind of sets the tone for how you run the deal.
So safe to say then we're setting like regulatory parameters, the biggest one being securities law probably, and Lowell sets good tone on this one.
Yeah.
And then you work within that framework as you're putting the deal together and telling the story and how it's marketed. And so we've got the securities law, so the guardrails, a lot of tax. What about, and I know you're involved in the actual execution of a sale and how it comes to bear. Can you speak a little bit about KYC and AML and how that plays into what you do? I know this has evolved over time, right? And so just how how that regulatory framework also impacts what you do in the execution of a sale.
Yeah, absolutely. I think last year there was a range of views on the question of whether for a single sale, if you're essentially selling a product, you need to do KYC or AML. If you're coming to a Home Depot and buy a bag of nails, nobody's asking you for your source of funds. And that view has kind of shifted significantly, and I think everyone's in the same place, which is if you're collecting large sums of money, regardless of what it is, a product, a security, a piece of software, you should be doing and performing AML KYC, and we work with Netkin and a number of other partners and service providers here to make sure that's dialed in, and that's not just a check the box exercise, but you really are kind of going through a deep process where you're doing things like negative news checks and collecting IDs, taking photos so that you're really compliant on that end, especially if you are running something that's close to selling a security, or you're doing an unregistered security sale. So AML KYC is table stakes for any deal that's being done right now.
And it's interesting, so we have the know your customer, right? KYC, we all know what this is. That's very important from a regulatory standpoint. It's also important from a tax standpoint because there are different rules about certain transaction taxes. So where your buyer exists may bear weight in whether sales tax applies or VAT or JCT if it's abroad. And so because if you're the issuer, this is relevant to you, right? Because you might be on the hook if you don't otherwise withhold those. And so think about tailoring those dependencies between normal KYC AML processes from a regulatory standpoint, but also the back-end reporting and tax. So you see how the dependencies come together, right? And it's sometimes unnatural, I think, for like 5 different advisors with different lenses to be involved in every conversation or being seated at the table at the same time, right? That can feel a little bit clunky. I think there's plenty of examples that we've experienced where while it is a number of voices on the phone or faces at the table, it does lend a sense of grace, right? Because I know from my own perspective, I'm talking about some wacky tax topic and people are looking at me funny, and then Stan grabs him on the back end. It's like, no, you need to pay attention to this right now. So those, like setting the right tone with your advisors, not necessarily putting yourself in the middle, I find to be important. Maybe just some brief stories on that because you're not going to solve all the regulatory ills right now, right? There's too many unknowns. But as it iterates, letting us collaborate together, I find to be really valuable. Would you mind sharing a quick comment on that? Whoever wants to go.
Yeah, I'll say that a lot of the companies we work with tend to be reasonably early stage, let's say Series A, B, or C, and in their kind of natural development process, most of the companies we work with don't have a general counsel. Many may have a VP of finance, but most don't have a CFO. And when we start getting into these conversations around essentially what is a kind of a large public financing, there's a lot of nuance, and there's a lot of expertise. And so that's why there's a number of advisors at the table, and while the advisors can do a lot of the work and give advice, there has to be somebody at the company who is able to digest it and act on it. And so it's helpful to have a group that works well together that can actually help you execute on what needs to be done. And so the tax work stream is actually a fairly large work stream, and somebody in the token sale process is going to spend a lot of their time, likely multiple people, thinking about it. If it's in an offshore jurisdiction, it's 2 additional dimensions of complexity. There's a token valuation process, and so kind of working closely with advisors that work well together help take some of that load off the company, and kind of help you grow the business, and also highlight where once the offering is done, what are the key next steps, and where you need to strengthen the organization. Do you need to bring in somebody on the legal side? Do you now need a COO, a CFO, like the capacity to handle not only tax, but also other new finance work streams? So we have a lot of those conversations on the front end of the deal, but also once the deal is done, kind of what's next. And it's about, okay, you've raised a lot of money. It's essentially like a Series C, Series D financing. How do you scale organizationally to be able to A, digest those funds and B, execute on the vision that you've put forward?
Yeah, I think that's great. I would say that from our perspective, we actually get brought in even earlier. So, I mean, people are thinking about an ICO or a SAFT or any kind of private financing. We talk to companies before they've even done that. And that is a particular kind of interesting scenario because when you're valuing tokens, and let's just say you're granting tokens to founders or employees ahead of any kind of potential financing that's occurred, there's a lot of education that's involved with talking to the client and making sure that they understand what the potential ramifications are. And when we're dealing with Rob and Rob mentions that someone may be interested in doing something like that, making sure that we're kind of validating the process and validating each other's kind of concerns on there is very helpful for the client to understand, because it's one thing that once you're going through and you're going full throttle towards an ICO or something like that, but when you're even before that, making sure that the client, or if you're going through a process of maybe granting tokens and understanding, there is potential value here, even though you haven't raised any money And that is a concept that I think we need to all understand a little bit, just because not everything's just worth, what the typical, like, I raise a company or start a company and, I just get founder stock and it's worth 0.00001. It's not necessarily the case. And there's there's a lot of discussions you can have about that, but at least in my world that I deal with, we come in to help, like, bring a little clarity to that.
And this is something that gets missed a lot, right? People talk about these great ideas. Hey, we're going to start this company. We're going to do an ICO. Let's get tokens out to the founders and the people early. And to reiterate, this is a taxable transaction, right? And the
exactly
value
right.
is really important. If you have nothing to support what that is worth, then all you have is the benefit of hindsight, which is this very valuable thing that you've just done. That's going to greatly impact the compensatory impact, the payroll taxes do, and the income taxes do of the recipient. So what's interesting is when you're just starting out and you're doing this, right, what do you have to show how to value a token, right? You have Stan advising on how this stuff comes together, maybe doing some modeling and forecasting. But other than that, what do you have? So there's this inherent tension because you need something that's buttoned up for tax because you don't want to be, smacked across the face later for a big tax bill, right? But how do you actually go about doing this the right way when you don't have anything, you don't have much history, right? It's brand new, it's an idea, it's a white paper. So I'd love to hear just on this topic, right? Like
sure.
Your pain points from a valuation perspective and how that plays out. And then Stan, I know you're frequently stuck in the middle, right? Because you want to have these great rosy pictures of the future, but it's not worth that much. It's like, how does this all shake out? How does it work?
That's an excellent point, because you have two kind of very different perspectives or lenses on this process. So sure, at the very beginning, it's like, how could this be worth anything? We haven't done anything. There's no revenue. The business model is still kind of taking shape. However, there is some sort of development or concept that's been put together. Obviously, there's been time spent on a white paper. There are things that have been thought of to address a certain market. So there is value in that, and there are different methodologies that you can play into to understand that. Anywhere from understanding how much has been spent into the overall concept, and then what you're expecting to put into it. And you can also look at potential, like, this is where kind of our words kind of mix a little bit in terms of understanding what it could potentially be worth in the future, but there's also risk associated with that. And so there's discounting that's heavily involved with that, and that's part of the methodologies that we can employ here in valuing anything. And it's a hybrid of, you might be familiar with kind of the 409A world, or just the typical valuation world. There's a hybrid of concepts there that you can apply to that, along with valuing IP, and through a mixture of all that, we can develop a framework that makes cohesive sense in understanding what something's worth at a very early stage, while also not saying this thing is worth I don't know, billions of dollars, when in fact there's certainly a lot of risk associated with it. So,
but then Stan is going to talk about it being worth billions of dollars.
That's exactly right.
So so let's be real.
Don't say it all
right?
the time.
So then, Stan, what do you say?
Well, let me go to a different point. So again, large public financing, when we do a kickoff meeting, there's over 100 work streams we go through. And this is an important one to have very early, because what we often have with clients is, there's already some tokens that were sold, and now the founder says, oh, by the way, I promised some employees some tokens, and you're like, well, wait.
Pause
and
right
now,
there.
And now this conversation starts, but you're already effectively in the transaction, and so that puts a lot of limits on what the tax team can do, what the valuation team can do, and that's why it's important to kind of have visibility into what all the work streams are and start executing on the important pieces, the front-run pieces early, because otherwise it gets very, very quick, very difficult to back.
That's exactly right. Starting as early in the process, actually when people don't think it's really necessary, is actually, that's a different process you want to take. So,
I mean, it's really hard. When you make a promise to a key employee, even if it's not written down, it's really hard to undo that promise, right? This is not the time to be upset in the apple cart. And so at the same time, right, Lowell would say, and by the way, half those people you promise stuff to, you can't do that. They wouldn't be what I think Lowell would say is an accredited investor, right? That sort of blows things up. Now what do you do, right? And so you're sort of caught in the crosshairs of all these different concepts. And this happens super early stage, right? You're putting ideas together, and the first thing you're doing is you're dividing up the pot. we haven't really drawn the pot yet, but we're going to divide it up anyway, right? Let's talk about it because we're going to make $1 billion, to use Neil's point. And so this creates tension on the front end, involve people early, understand the legal guardrails, understand how it plays into what Stan is doing, how this plays into valuation methodologies, and know the truth about the taxation. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, the other piece around valuation is what you and I talk about, which is, okay, if we're doing this in a place other than US, we have to take a bunch of this new IP you created by sitting around and discussing these tokens and move it elsewhere in the world for many strategic and financial reasons. And so there's a big valuation work stream there that you guys perform to try to get a sense of, okay, what is this intellectual property? Is there actual software moving? And what's the value of all that?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, we're frequently thinking about, outside of our borders and people expanding their business operations, even in the inception of a company. And whenever you're crossing borders, this causes extraordinary valuation. I'll call it anxiety and how you value that stuff. We have a lot of rules and regulations from a tax perspective, an income tax perspective, analogous to but different from what's used for payroll tax purposes and valuations of tokens, and all this stuff gets caught in the middle. You got to take it serious. Questions?
How is that changing? So with the new tax bill in December last year, we did a lot of work around Cayman, around BVI, Hong Kong, Singapore. What's the current fairway from your perspective? How is that changing founders' trade-offs of doing something offshore versus doing something onshore?
No, that's a good question. If anybody was watching, December 22nd, we had a little tax bill that landed in DC and caused a bit of a shockwave throughout the system. And the short answer there is the corporate income tax rates in the U.S. came down significantly. And there's even further benefits from selling IP, intellectual property, out of the U.S. from a tax perspective. And so the question is, like, what does that do to IP structures? And what I'll say is tax should never be the only reason that you form a multinational company and move IP. If that's the only reason, you'll be miserable and you will ultimately challenge and probably fail upon exam. And so while tax was a significant data point in developing a non-US operation, including leading up to a sale, it wasn't the only driver. If that was the only driver, we'd really struggle with it. But to answer your question, it's become less of a valuable data point when you think about orchestrating a multinational structure to do an ICO versus domestic structure. You're talking about a 10% difference. And it's really hard to get there, right? And there's a lot of work in setting up international operations and what one of my colleagues calls living in the structure, right? You got to live in the structure, otherwise it's challenged, and you're back to the corporate rate of 21%, and you've burned all this anxiety about setting up international entities, et cetera. So it's changed a lot, but I'd say tax wasn't the only reason driving non-US sales and structuring. It's still not the only one, and we see a lot of people still looking at debating whether to go abroad in here. And frankly, a lot of that's regulatory, right? If Lowell was here, he would talk about the differences in selling stuff in the US versus abroad and the regulatory frameworks you fit in. If you do decide to go abroad, he would say you're still not outside the regulatory grasp of the SEC. I think he'd say that. I'm channeling Lowell, right? Yeah. I'm not. We've got some time left. Questions? Good.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Well, we can. I'm not sure if they can.
Okay, two questions. Two quick questions.
Oh, they can now. Try it again. Okay.
Two quick questions. Number one, if I could get your opinion from an investor's standpoint in ICOs on SAFTs, safes, dates, and all these new vehicles that get really confusing from the investor side. And then the second question is, I'd like your opinions about these massive raises all at one time and treasury management and capital management for these organizations after they raise this money, kind of single bite at the apple type of thing from a traditional investing seed A series and so on. The capital goes out as the company grows, and I'd like to hear your beliefs on these big raises versus the more traditional series raises.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Lowell's going to answer your first one, and then you'll answer the second one. So what Lowell would say is hire counsel early. And I think what he'd say is the form of your instruments are highly relevant, but the substance of the company and the activities of the company are also really relevant to how that plays into the regulatory environment. And there's a range of opinions among attorneys. There's a lot of attorneys in this space. From my perspective, we work across probably 50 different law firms on this topic. Lowell with Perkins Coie has a ton of experience in this. There's some that have more experience than others and actually have dialogue with the SEC and can help you, from a more informed point of view, tell you what to do. There are no crystal clear answers right now. Everybody's figuring this out. But that's one thing you don't want to mess with, because that's the rule that helps you with an orange outfit versus some other color. So, pay attention to that and hire legal counsel early. Listen to what they're doing, and I always tell people, hire the attorneys. They're going to say, don't do that. And that's okay. Versus those who are like, well, it's sort of okay and it's a little bit gray. I would not listen to those people personally, right, if it's me, because this is a really big deal. And so you want the ones, test them out. Maybe test them about, some ideas that are maybe provocative in the blogs. And you want the attorney that says, that's a really bad idea. That's the tone you want. And that's my own personal test. Of course, I can't give securities law advice, but why don't you address the second one?
Well, let me just touch on the first one from an investor perspective. I think there's a lot of comfort now with both the utility token process here or elsewhere in the world and the SAF or safety path. I think buyers in sales understand how those work and those traditional instruments. There's this new field of security token emerging. I think that's where we're still kind of testing the waters to understand. From a buyer's perspective, who's really interested in this? Is it something that's at all addressable to the national audience or not at all? But kind of those things that have been around for more than 3 months are sort of reasonably well understood by investors, if that's your question.
So do you want to talk about the mix of traditional equity versus tokens a little bit? Was that your other part of your question?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right in saying that the dominant view of the issuers is you kind of get one shot at this now, just because the market is so young, and you're also competing for attention with so many other issuers, and so you have this one big push to to take as much off the table as you can. From a corporate finance perspective, of course, this is exactly wrong, right? You want to be raising as the company matures, as you have new milestones, because you get to step up your valuation, et cetera. We as a practice are having more and more discussions about secondary offerings of tokens, tying things to milestones, or doing a large raise and tying that either in a smart contract form or just purely contractually to milestones, and then having either clawbacks or burning some tokens, et cetera. As a piece of governance discussion around the sale as a whole. I think secondary token sales are coming. They're just not here yet. And this is, again, will be much more relevant in a securities token context where the capital market and corporate finance dynamics are, let's say, just more traditional.
Good. Other questions? Anybody? Yes, sir.
My question is regarding the tax treatment of securities, because if it was a utility, I heard that some of the guys were paying taxes. It was treated as revenue, right? So if you say security now, I presume that it's not, treated as a raise and it's a capital investment. And the second question is, some of the ICOs, they don't necessarily form a legal entity, right? So they just raise funds and the tokens are held in multi-sig wallets, things like that. And I'm wondering how that conundrum is and, what your comments are. Okay. Thank you.
Yep. So your first question about when we talk about utility tokens versus security tokens, remember that there's a different lens that you put on what these things are, whether it's securities law, whether it's tax, whether it's sort of business strategy. We use these terms interchangeably. They all mean something very different. So when you talk about securities tokens, that's a sort of a legal definition. Within securities, though, there can be lots of different tax definitions. Most sales of securities are still going to be a taxable transaction at some point. It's only when you have an equity token that's respected as equity for tax does it change the tax treatment? So generally, as you noted, the sales of tokens are taxable transactions because what you're doing is you're selling property, right? That may be different from a GAAP answer, may or may not be different, probably different for GAAP. It's probably different from a securities law perspective. For tax, you're usually selling property. It's revenue on the front end. You hear about people writing about, blogging about, bragging about deferrals, right? For whatever wacky concepts. It's really hard to defer. Generally, the sales of property, when you have a receipt of funds including crypto, taxable today, generally. It depends, right? We do a lot of heavy analysis on this end, but the legal construct that you build, the sort of the way that you market it, what it represents, all the different data points, you add all that stuff up, and all those data points bear weight from a securities law perspective, from a marketing, right? From a valuation of the token, it all bears big relevance there. You had a second question that I now forgot. I'm so sorry. What was that?
What happens when the founders hold the...
No legal entity. Yeah. Clunky. I would say don't do that. You want to call out what it is. I mean, and there's a lot of, I guess, legal reasons to do that, but from a tax perspective, it would inure back to the person, and individual rates. You got a little bit of relief. We're down to 37% at the federal level, but you lost your state tax deduction. So if you're in California and that inures to you, you're looking at 50.3% basically. So just kind of where's the worry, and it's also a little bit clunky. It's a little bit weird. I wouldn't an ICO on your 1040 Schedule C. I don't think that's a great idea, but to each their own. Yeah, did you have another comment on no legal entity?
I mean, and you don't necessarily need a new entity to do a token sale. It's all a balance of like the various issues that we're talking about. You can do it from your, founding first Delaware C corp, and then as you go through the process, you'll have an agreement between yourselves and the token buyers, whether it's in terms of sale or a SAFT or some other or subscription agreement or some other form of a legal contract. But that's fine to be between the original company and the buyers. It doesn't necessarily need to be a special purpose entity or a subsidiary.
Yes, sir.
So we keep hearing that the SEC is looking at tokens from a security perspective. In other words, all tokens are security tokens. It's all still, as you said, very unclear, but where do you think the SEC is going to go with that? Are they going to continue to use that screen specifically? And is there concern from your perspective really that we will be moving all tokens into the security space? Second question is, with the current market correction, are you seeing a reduction in the number of ICOs?
It's a good question. We're going to give you Lowell's personal phone number so you can call at the end of this, and he will be happy to pontificate with you. I mean, I don't know. There's a lot of data points out there that the SEC they're protecting investors, but they're also trying to promote solid commerce, and I think that it's really nice. Personally, I like that we actually have a government agency that's trying to do the right thing rather than just acting politically. They're looking after commerce. Some say that this is good commerce. That's great, but they're also trying to scare people who are being too cavalier about this stuff. So I'm interested to your perspective about the SEC.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of discussion around that, and we read a lot about it, but nothing has been definitive in terms of where it's exactly headed. But like you said, it's reading the tea leaves a little bit, and I think we are going to see some sort of more definitive regulation. Maybe not to the extreme of what we see in some countries out in Europe, because they may be a little bit ahead of the curve on some of this. So I think there's going to be some sort of hybrid in terms of where that's headed. In terms of the second question, unless you have some. So yeah.
How's the deal flow stand?
Well, let me come back to the first question because it's incredibly important. I think the Chairman Clayton yesterday gave a talk at Princeton, talked about ICOs, and the question to him was, were they all frauds? And the answer was, of course not. But the question of were they all securities was not addressed, which is a great question. And it certainly feels like things are headed that way. Yeah. That's why we internally developed broker-dealer capability that we're able to assist in the regulated activity set that comes along with it. So certainly in the US, it feels like that's where things are shifting. And on the deal flow question, we actually see a lot more inbound of folks now getting more comfort with the token process. It's more familiar to them in a traditional securities framework. deal flow overall, I think what we're seeing is actually a filtering. We're seeing a lot more mature companies, later stage venture funded companies, and even public companies that have a product that makes more sense as an open source piece of software funded in open source fashion. You know, you have kind of quality deals rising to the top, and that's what we're seeing. So the volume is less, but the quality is higher.
Yeah, and sorry, I think we were seeing a ton of like different types of activity, and maybe less on the pure ICO front, but a lot of private raises and a lot of just airdrops. I know that's a little bit kind of a different category, but yeah, the types of raises are different, and maybe they're not just kind of focused on the ICO, but I think that there's different kind of complexities around some of the more private kind of focus token sales. So the volume is still there. It's just changed in terms of how we're kind of categorizing it.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. The big blown out public sale, we're seeing I think fewer of those. It's a lot more sort of private placement-ish feeling things, which is different from all the analysis changes from tax perspective. I know from legal as well. So okay. I assume there's a hook that'll grab me, but let's keep going.
Have you all seen any acquisition activity of crypto companies, and if so, what did the distributions look like for the token holders versus the equity holders? And if not, what do you think it would look like?
That's a very interesting question. I'm not
Have
sure
you seen M&A activity yet? I'll let you go first.
So we've certainly had a lot of conversations with clients about both token for token M&A and companies acquiring the technology of a company that went through a token sale process. It gets very complicated. Because traditional acquirers view the token sale as having lots of theoretical future liability, and so we start talking about acquiring assets or acquiring equity. I think there was one deal done where two tokens merged, but so we've seen lots of conversations, but it hasn't quite been done yet, or it hasn't become mainstream. That said, that's coming. That's certainly the traditional suite of corporate finance is coming to the space. Secondaries, tender offers, M&A. All of it's going to be here in the next 12 months.
Yeah, we're seeing some deals come together and pretty interesting, right? Because you just have these bizarre dynamics of two companies now coming together to become one, and it influences valuations and the structure of the deal. One thing to note, though, you talked about token distributions. So remember that if you have a token, most tokens inside corporate solution, if that leaves corporate solution, that's generally taxable to the company. You can't have appreciated property that leaves corporate solution without triggering tax. So that adds to a bit of complexity in the deal and how you would structure it. Now, asset sale versus stock deals, I think that dynamic I just mentioned would bear significant weight. We are seeing this happen. We've been talking about it for a long time, actually, which is why it's kind of nice where you have advisors that know one another and we can kind of strategize together. This is super wonky, right? This is not the norm. And so to have the background in the traditional transactions, bring that into an M&A deal, I would say even more reason to get your advisors on the front end, because the design of the transaction will bear a lot of weight how it plays out.
Yep, and all this has been super helpful, a lot of pointed questions. What I haven't heard any advisory board talk about is, could you take me from white paper to ICO and just maybe a 2-minute overview of the process to get there? Because I think there's a lot of good companies maybe sitting here that have a white paper, they're ready to go, they want to do an ICO, but that may be 2-month process or 4-week process, however long it takes.
You want to do your...
We have 29 seconds to address this question.
I assume there's a hook or some explosive that's going to come at me if we don't.
No, look, it's again, large public financing is a forced march. It's it's 3 to 6 months of work. It's a lot of front-loaded preparation, thinking about the legal pieces we covered here, the token economics. Thinking about the marketing strategy, thinking about where you're going to be with your product, whether the product's going to be live, whether it's live on testnet or mainnet, how you're engaging with your customers, how you're building partnerships, like all of that drives kind of the crescendo of the to create a successful offering. And so it's a large multi-work stream process, as I guess is all that I can say.
I mean, I think after doing enough of these, you understand the different, work streams, but it's important to know that everything is very different. I was criticized the other day with this guy. He's like, just give me your playbook and tell us what to do. I'm like, that's sort of a funny question. I can't advise like that. You really need to think about, what are your business goals? What are the existing what does the existing company look like, talk about the different strategies. You need to play out what a mature state ecosystem looks like. You can't stop with just the raise because you don't know what that is, right? What is that? It's just sort of fundraising, and that changes everything if it's just fundraising. This is a business, right? If we're just fundraising for a maybe, it's a little bit weird. Yeah. So you got to try and play it all out, and it's very different for every transaction. So.